Speakers. Communication. Hi, my name is Paul Hamilton, and I am a poet. And I'd just like to say how honoured I am to have been invited to talk without proviso, as it were, here on Resonance FM tonight. And I'd actually like to start proper by expressing my appreciation for Resonance as an entity. I've been involved with them on several projects over the last couple of years. The Screaming Hour, my Top 10 Prime Numbers, Bring It Back, and of course Burn the Horse. And incidentally, when I was initially invited to appear on Burn the Horse, I had no idea just how literal the title of the programme is. Incredibly thought-provoking. Sunday mornings, 5:20. Resonance is a wonderful setup, although like all visionary innovations, it does have its tiresome, narrow-minded detractors. We've all heard their bleating. Some say it's just a collection of mediocre, self-indulgent attention seekers with no real discernible talent. Others say it's a sort of acoustic version of the Emperor's New Clothes, and that you can call any limp, half-thought-out piece of erratic, conceptual idleness art. And yet others drone on about its spectacular lack of relevance to anyone or anything other than the inexplicably swollen egos of the people involved and the sense of embarrassed loyalty of their immediate friends and family. And my reply to those criticisms are, get the frying pan off your fox, gargle, gargle. So, my brief tonight is to talk to you for about 15 minutes on whatever subject I choose. Well, thank you, Resonance FM. I shall. So, what am I going to talk about? Excuse me. Well, I don't know. How about that? I'll just open my mouth, will my brain to move my larynx, and let's hear what happens. Poetry. Whoa. Haven't surprised myself there. Excuse me. Poetry. Well, I am a poet. I think one is born a poet. I do not think one can just become a poet any more than one can just become a shop assistant. Words have always been my friends. The very first word I uttered was mama, which I was fascinated to discover some years later is an obscure 14th century word meaning an ecclesiastical vow of penance. I have absolutely no idea where I would have heard such a word, but, it doesn't actually surprise me that even at the age of 5, my antennae were open to the etymologically aconventional. I'm guessing that we all read The Ancient Mariner at school. I became very familiar with it after being made to copy it out. I don't know how many occasions, for breaking the rules. And in hindsight, I regret not standing up in class and saying to my long-suffering English lit teacher, "Hey, do you know what, Mr. Gore? Breaking the rules? It's what I do." At the end of the day, a true poet defines his own rules. I have defined my own rules, or should I say rule, and that rule is, don't define rules, break them. And one of the rules I've broken is that all poets apparently must have poetic influences. Well, I pride myself on the fact that I have never once read the work of other poets, apart from The Ancient Mariner. And other poets say to me, "What, Paul, you haven't read Milton or Keats, Wordsworth, Longcock or Padley?" And I say no, and I never will. And you know why? because my poetry must be exactly that, my poetry. If I read Paradise Lost or The Wasted Land, my muse would be infected with that stuff. It's like GM crops. And people will say, have you never heard of standing on the shoulders of giants? And I say, yes, and I won't do it. And they say, why? And I say, because I prefer to stand on my own shoulders. It's sometimes very hard. They tell me Larkin is wonderful, but I won't read him, or Tennyson, or Eliot, or any of the other greats, not until the day I die. And even then I'll give them a miss. I may pride myself on this vow, but I cannot describe the despair I have sometimes felt, and no doubt will continue to feel when I consider the sacrifice I have made, so that my poetry stays pure. You know, one of the most wonderful dreams I ever had was about Rabbi Burns. It was Burns night some years ago, and I'd been to a supper. And when the haggis had been brought to table, there was, of course, the traditional reading of Ode to a Haggis. And in keeping with my need to maintain poetical neutrality, I had been obliged to sit with my fingers in my ears during the reading. Later that night, in a deep slumber, a little the worse for wear in terms of the amount of drams I'd enjoyed that evening, I dreamt, or did I, that the great Rabbi Burns was standing at the foot of my bed. I'll never forget it. He looked sadly at me for some moments, and then he said very gently, "I understand, Mr. Hamilton. Don't fret yourself. I do understand." I woke up weeping. So, what is the process I go through when I'm writing a poem? I can't believe I've just asked that question. But it seems such a random phenomenon. I have found myself composing poetry whilst fingering avocados. I have found myself composing poetry in the middle of a Chang Fai class. I once found myself composing poetry whilst making love. A tribute to Nye Bevan, oddly enough. I have found myself composing poetry whilst defleeing my chinchilla, touring a German U-boat, sawing the head off a dead squirrel, and, please, don't ask. I have found myself composing poetry in all kinds of weird and wonderful situations, but hardly ever when I have sat down with the intention of composing poetry. This gift seems to come unbidden. The key is in my use of the phrase, "I find myself composing poetry." Sometimes I feel as if I have been possessed by a poem. I am its slave, and its will compels me to present it to the world, and its will shall not be denied. Well, here is one slave who does not yearn for freedom. The wearing of the heavy chains of poetry may be a difficult destiny, but one I would not change, even if I wanted to. Sometimes I don't compose so much as record. I have somewhere here a poem I wrote 4 years ago. I was in my local pub and had been joined by one of the regulars, a lone drinker, face scarlet from years of constant ingestion of alcohol. This poem is called "The Alcoholic and the Barmaid from Hungary." No, Adrian, I will not look at that top Ingrid is wearing. No, Adrian, I would not like to pull the zip down so that those lovely big melons fall out. No, Adrian, I will not ask for a packet of crisps so that she bends over and shows her arse. No, Adrian. Adrian, no. You see 3D, page 3, with your beer-stained eyes, and I see a brave young woman in a cowardly old town who yearns for her mama's goulash. There's a footnote to that, incredibly, to me at least. Ingrid went on to marry Adrian. And they have 3 sons. I think a poet without a sense of humour is like a child with its legs hacked off with an axe. I was with a rather cynical friend of mine one day, and we were accompanied by a rather, shall we say, earnest poet. At one point, this earnest poet asked us what we thought the job of a poet was. My cynical friend replied, "Probably something in catering." The poet was not amused, and started berating my friend. My friend, now admittedly a little drunk, interrupted him by getting him in a headlock and slapping the top of his head in time to the mantra of "Cheer up, cheer up." It was a wonderfully spontaneous moment, and although that particular poet has not spoken to me since, that event helped me to see that it is vital that a poet not take himself too seriously. I, for one, will never do that. I have several poems that unfortunately are a little too experimental for most of the audiences I encounter. And I rather think that as far as Resonance FM is concerned, they are perhaps not experimental enough. But hey, let's have a bash. Here's one of them. It's called First Words, and is my attempt to crystallize the emergence and development of human speech. I need. That poem also benefits from a physical aspect to its performance. I usually begin it in a fetal position and slowly unfurl like a fern leaf on some forgotten savannah. This next one is called Spaceship. Well, I think I may have talked enough for now. I hope I've been of some interest and inspiration, perhaps. For any budding poets who may be listening, all I can say is, find your own voice. How do you find your own voice? By not listening to other people. And keep yourself from going stale. How do you keep yourself from going stale? By outraging yourself at least 10 times a day. Be sexually flirtatious with a very old lady. Eat horse oats. Buy some gloves and then throw them away. Now, I don't mean actually do these things. They have already been done by me. Think of your own things to do. We can hear someone outside the room. I'm not going to have that edited out, because that's the spirit of Resonance. Somebody going to the loo in the background. But most of all, remember, you are a poet, and as such, and I mean this in absolutely no egotistical or arrogant way, touched by divinity. Good night.